come to realize that these early archaeologists were themselves myth makers. And so one of the fascinating things about studying Minoan Crete is that you're often untangling the myths not only from early Greece, but also the myths which have come down from some of these archaeologists, Arthur Evans included.
For over a century, the Phaistos Disc has defeated every linguist, codebreaker, and historian who tried to read it. 241 symbols stamped into clay using a technique not reinvented for 3,000 years, and not one person has confirmed what they mean. Now Grok AI claims it has cracked the code, and what it says the ancient message reveals is raising some serious questions. If the interpretation is even partly correct, we may have to rethink what we know about the civilization that created it. The discovery that rewrote everything we thought we knew. In January of 2026, a researcher named Konstantinos Ragatsas from the Lawrenceville School released a paper that did something nobody had seriously attempted in over a century of studying this object. He ignored the symbols entirely. He stopped trying to read the disc and instead asked a completely different kind of question. He asked what the object was physically designed to do. And the answer he found has forced archaeologists to reconsider everything they assumed about one of the most mysterious artifacts ever pulled from the ground. Ragatsas examined the manufacturing process of the disc at a level of detail that previous researchers had either overlooked or dismissed. He discovered that the depth of the stamp impressions on one side of the disc was noticeably deeper and more uniform than on the other side. That might sound like a minor observation, but it carries enormous implications. It means the clay had already started to dry by the time the maker flipped the disc over and began stamping the second face. The two sides were not completed in a single sitting. They were produced in stages, which tells us something critical about intention. This was not a quick inscription scratched into wet clay the way a scribe would record a transaction or a prayer. This was a carefully engineered object, built in phases with deliberate precision. He also noticed that the spiral guideline carved into the surface varies in regularity between the two faces. One spiral is smoother and more controlled than the other, reinforcing the idea that the disc was worked on over time as the material changed beneath the maker's hands. The consistency of the spiral on one face, compared to the slight wavering on the other, suggests the maker was highly skilled, but working against the physical limitations of drying clay, adjusting pressure and technique as the medium stiffened under their tools. But the most unsettling finding had nothing to do with the clay itself. It had to do with the direction the figures face. The signs stamped along the outer rim of the disc all point outward, facing away from the center and toward anyone looking at the object from the outside. The signs deeper inside the spiral follow the path of the spiral itself. That dual orientation makes no sense for a written text. If you are reading a document, you expect every character to face the same direction so your eyes can follow the flow. But if you are sitting around a board game with other players, you want the figures closest to the edge to face the people looking at them. You want the outer ring to be readable from any seat at the table. Think about that for a second. Every scholar for the past 100 years has been trying to read the disc as though it were a page in a book, assuming the symbols run in a single reading direction from start to finish. But the outward-facing figures along the rim break that assumption completely. They are oriented for multiple viewers positioned around the object, not for a single reader holding it in their hands. That is a fundamental difference in design logic, and it went unnoticed for decades because nobody thought to ask why the figures face the directions they do. Ragatsas drew direct comparisons to ancient Egyptian board games like Mehen, which used segmented spiral tracks representing coiled snakes, and whose rules involved sequential movement along divided paths. The Phaistos Disc, with its 61 compartments arranged in a tight spiral and separated by rigid dividing strokes, fits that template with uncomfortable precision. The game of Mehen dates back to at least 3000 BC in Egypt, and was played on a coiled serpent board divided into segments, with players moving pieces from the tail at the outer edge inward toward the head at the center. The structural resemblance to the Phaistos Disc is striking enough that Ragatsas argued the connection deserves serious investigation rather than dismissal. And if the disk is not a text at all, but a procedural device, then every statistical pattern that researchers have spent decades analyzing is not evidence of grammar or vocabulary. It is evidence of rules. A sealed room, a fire, and an object that should have been dust. The disk was pulled from the earth on the 3rd of July, 1908, by an Italian excavation team led by Luigi Pernier. They found it inside a basement storage cell beneath Room 8 of Building 101 at the Palace of Phaistos on the southern coast of Crete. The room was part of the formal northeastern entrance complex of one of the most important Minoan palaces ever excavated, and the cell itself was accessible only from above, sealed beneath a layer of fine plaster. The Palace of Phaistos was not a minor site. It was one of the largest and most powerful centers of Minoan civilization, rivaling Knossos in scale and political significance. Situated on a hill overlooking the fertile Messara plain, it controlled agricultural production and trade routes across southern Crete for centuries. The complex where the disk was found had already been partially destroyed and rebuilt at least once before the final catastrophe that sealed the basement cell. That layered history of construction and destruction makes it extremely difficult to pin down exactly when the disk was placed in the chamber and whether it was stored deliberately or swept there by collapsing architecture. The fill inside that cell was black earth mixed with ash and fragments of burnt animal bone. Something devastating had happened to this part of the palace, and whatever was stored in that underground chamber had been locked inside by destruction. And that destruction is the only reason the disk survived. You have to understand something about Minoan record-keeping that most people never learn. The vast majority of clay tablets and administrative sealings produced by the Minoans were never intentionally fired. They were left as raw, unfired clay, which means they were fragile and temporary by design. The only reason any of them survived the centuries is that accidental palace fires baked them hard enough to last. Without fire, those records would have dissolved back into the earth within a generation. The administrative system of the Minoans was built on impermanence. Records were meant to be updated, overwritten, and eventually discarded, not preserved for eternity. The clay was a working medium, not an archival one. The Phaistos Disc is different. It was deliberately and thoroughly fired before it ended up in that sealed deposit. That alone makes it exceptional. But the fire that destroyed part of the palace created the airtight, ash-filled tomb that preserved it for nearly 4 millennia. Senior curator Maria Vlazaki of the Heraklion Archaeological Museum put it in terms that still echo through the field. She said the disk arrived in a deposit that should have reduced every unfired tablet to dust, and that the fire which destroyed the palace is the only reason the museum still holds it. A tablet designated PH1 was found just centimeters away from the disk, sitting roughly 50 centimeters higher in the same black deposit layer. That proximity and shared stratigraphy link the disk directly to the Minoan administrative world, even though its script is completely unlike anything found on Linear A tablets. Scholars have dated the deposit to a window spanning roughly 1850 to 1600 BC under the Middle Minoan III classification, though some researchers push the date as late as the early 1400s BC. That dating uncertainty spans roughly 400 years, which is an enormous window when you are trying to place an object within the rapidly shifting political landscape of Bronze Age Crete. The disk now sits in Room 3 of the Heraklion Archaeological Museum under the designation AE 1358. It measures between 15.8 and 16.5 centimeters across, with a thickness ranging from 1.6 to 2.1 centimeters. It is not perfectly round. It is slightly egg-shaped, with one face gently concave and the other gently convex. The catastrophe that saved the disk also destroyed whatever context might have explained what it was for. 45 stamps and a technology, 3,000 years too early. Every single one of the 241 signs on the disk was made the same way. Someone pressed a small, pre-carved stamp into soft clay, lifted it away, moved to the next position, and pressed again. No freehand carving, no scratching with a stylus. Every instance of a particular symbol is identical to every other instance because they all came from the same physical tool. That process is, by every formal definition, movable type printing. And it was executed roughly 3,000 years before Johannes Gutenberg built his press in Mainz. The implications of that timeline are staggering. It means someone in the Bronze Age Mediterranean understood the principle of reusable, standardized type and applied it to produce a consistent, repeatable set of symbols on a prepared surface. They solved the core engineering problem of printing, and then the solution disappeared from the historical record entirely, as though it had never existed. Typesetter and linguist Herbert Breakley examined the disc and confirmed that it satisfies every criterion of the typographic principle. Identical material types are reproduced repeatedly across a prepared surface using reusable tools. Jared Diamond later described the innovation as appearing at the wrong moment in history, which is why the technique vanished without a trace and had to be independently reinvented millennia later. Diamond argued that the broader social and economic conditions needed to sustain printing technology simply did not exist in the Bronze Age. So even a genuine breakthrough could not propagate beyond the individual or workshop that created it. 45 distinct stamp faces were used. Some signs appear rotated 90 or 180 degrees relative to their neighbors, though scholars generally treat those rotations as non-meaningful and count them as the same sign. Under magnification, researchers have found spots where a stamp was pressed into the clay, then erased while the surface was still soft enough to work, and replaced with a different or corrected impression. Whoever made this was editing as they went. That editing behavior is significant because it tells us the maker cared about accuracy. They were not stamping symbols at random or decorating the surface for aesthetic effect. They had a specific sequence in mind, and when they made a mistake, they corrected it before the clay set. Beyond the stamped figures, the maker also used a pointed stylus to cut a continuous spiral guideline on each face, short radial strokes dividing the spiral into 61 discrete compartments. A start marker made of a radial stroke accompanied by 5 punched dots and 18 short diagonal strokes placed beneath certain signs. Those additional markings were done by hand, not by stamp, which means the disc combines two entirely different production techniques on a single surface. The stamped symbols required precision tooling and advanced preparation. The hand-carved lines required freehand control and spatial judgment. Whoever made this was fluent in both methods and knew exactly when to use each one. The 18 diagonal strokes placed beneath certain signs on both faces deserve particular attention. Those marks are not stamps. They were incised by hand with a stylus after the stamping was complete, which means they were added as a secondary layer of information on top of the primary symbol sequence. Some researchers have interpreted them as accent marks or emphasis indicators. Others have suggested they function as modifiers that alter the meaning or value of the sign they accompany. In a game context, they could represent bonus conditions, special moves, or variable point values assigned to specific compartments. Whatever their purpose, they represent a deliberate system of annotation applied consistently across the disc, and their hand-carved nature proves the maker returned to the object after the stamping phase to add further detail. Epigrapher John G. Younger captured the core mystery during a recorded conversation in 2023. He pointed out that we have only the impressions and that the absence of the stamps themselves is almost as striking as the disc. Someone manufactured a complete set of reusable tools for a script that appears nowhere else on any surface ever recovered from the ancient world. The investment required to carve 45 individual stamps from hard material, whether stone, bone, or hardwood, represents a significant commitment of time and skill. That level of investment only makes sense if the stamps were intended for repeated use across multiple objects, which deepens the mystery of why no other stamped disc or tablet has ever been found. Those stamps have never been found, not a single one, and without them, we cannot know whether the disc was meant to be a unique creation or just one product of a much larger system that vanished completely. The numbers that refuse to be random. Side A of the disc carries roughly 123 stamped signs. Side B carries 119. One sign on side A is too damaged to identify with certainty. The 61 compartments contain between 2 and 7 signs each, and the patterns inside those compartments are where things start to feel deeply strange. The sign scholars call the plumed head, designated number 02 in Arthur Evans's original numbering system, appears 19 times across the disc. Every single time it appears, it sits at the beginning of its group. Not most of the time, every time. The shield sign, number 12, appears 17 times, and 13 of those occurrences fall immediately after the plumed head. That pairing is not a coincidence you can wave away. In linguistic terms, if the plumed head functions like a prefix or determinative, its absolute restriction to the initial position suggests a grammatical role so rigid that no exception exists in the entire corpus. In game terms, it could represent a mandatory starting condition that must precede a specific action every single time it appears. In 2026, statistician Manolis Chavadakis ran 20,000 randomized simulations, preserving the overall sign frequencies but shuffling the adjacency relationships. The plumed head-to-shield combination scored a z-value of positive 12.05 against that null model. To put that in perspective, a z-score above 3 is already considered statistically extreme in most scientific fields. 12 is so far beyond chance that you would need to run the simulation billions of times before stumbling onto that pattern accidentally. The exclusive word initial placement of the plumed head produced a z-score of positive 7.51. And when Chavadakis looked at entire multi-sign groups that repeat identically across the disc, he found a refrain density of roughly 24.6% across all 61 compartments. Nearly a quarter of the groups are repeated sequences. That level of repetition is unusual for any kind of continuous text, but entirely expected in something governed by procedural rules, where certain combinations recur because the same conditions trigger the same responses. 9 of the 45 signs appear only once on the entire object. 26 signs occur at least once on each face. The frequency distribution is sharply skewed, with a small number of signs doing most of the work and a long tail of rare appearances. That skewed distribution is consistent with both natural language, where a few common words carry most of the meaning, and rule-based systems, where a few core operations dominate play. Brent Davis observed in a 2019 Oxford Journal of Archaeology seminar that several of these positional behaviors mirror patterns found in linear A more closely than chance would predict. That does not hand us sound values or translations, but it does suggest the two systems might have been shaped by the same underlying habits, whether linguistic or procedural. Those regularities are real, they are measurable, and they persist, whether you believe the disc is a text, a hymn, a game board, or something else entirely. The forgery accusation and the sign that proved it wrong. In 2008, art dealer and forgery specialist Jerome Eisenberg published a series of articles in the journal Minerva, arguing that the disc was a modern fake. His theory was that Luigi Pernier, possibly working with the restorer Émile Guilleron, fabricated the entire object in 1908. Eisenberg pointed to the absence of known parallels at the time of discovery, the unusually high quality of the stamping, and a possible inspiration in the Etruscan Magliano disc, discovered in 1882. He also noted that Pernier was under professional pressure to produce significant finds, and that Guilleron had the technical skill to manufacture convincing forgeries, having produced replicas and reconstructions for archaeological sites across the Mediterranean. The accusation landed hard. The Heraklion Museum has never allowed thermoluminescence dating, which would require removing small physical samples from the disk, and that refusal gave the forgery theory room to breathe in public discourse, even as most specialists rejected it. The museum's position has always been that the disk is too valuable and too fragile to subject to destructive testing. But critics have argued that a single definitive date would silence the forgery debate permanently, and that the refusal itself fuels suspicion. But one particular sign on the disk effectively destroys the forgery hypothesis on its own. Sign 21, which scholars describe as a comb, appears on the disk in a form that was completely unknown in 1908. No published parallel existed anywhere in the archaeological record at the time Pernier recovered the disk. Then, in 1955, archaeologist Doro Levy excavated ceiling HM 992 at Phaistos itself, in a sealed, securely dated context, and that ceiling carried an identical form of the comb sign. A further match appeared on a bowl recovered even later. A forger working in 1908 would have needed to invent a highly specific, completely arbitrary sign shape and then wait 47 years for the archaeological record to independently confirm it. That is not how forgery works. Forgers copy what already exists. They do not predict future discoveries. The comb sign alone should have ended the forgery debate permanently. But the absence of thermoluminescence data and the lingering mystique of the disk kept the conversation alive in popular media long after specialists had moved on. Additional parallels to other disk signs appeared on the Archalochori axe, excavated in 1934, and the Malia altar stone excavated in 1937, both recovered long after the disk surfaced. Studies of protopalatial clay artifacts from Phaistos, including pot marks and impressed fine ware, have also identified technical and fabric features consistent with the disk, reinforcing a local Minoan origin. Pavel Hnila reviewed the full debate in 2009 and concluded that the arguments for authenticity currently outweigh those against it. The forgery claim never gained majority support among specialists, but the residual uncertainty it created has continued to shadow every interpretation proposed since. A century of confident translations that all collapsed. Within months of the disk's discovery, Italian archaeologist Alessandro Della Seta noticed something that most later researchers ignored. He pointed out that the rigid, compartmented spiral layout looked more like a game board than continuous prose, and suggested the object might encode rules rather than narrative text. That observation, made over a century ago, anticipated the 2026 manufacturing analysis by more than 100 years. But the field moved in a different direction. Researchers across the 20th century proposed that the disk was a religious hymn meant for oral performance, a ritual chant, an administrative inventory like a linear A tablet, a calendrical device for tracking cyclical time, or a legal and military document. Independent researchers attempted readings in early Greek dialects, Luwian hieroglyphic, Finno-Ugric languages, and even entirely non-linguistic systems. Not one of those readings gained acceptance from the broader epigraphic community. Each new translation was typically greeted with initial excitement, followed by detailed criticism exposing the arbitrary choices and unsupported assumptions that held it together, followed by quiet abandonment as the next confident translator stepped forward. John Younger and Paul Rehack noticed a structural asymmetry in 2008 that adds another layer of complexity. Groups on side A frequently begin with similar signs, creating an effect that resembles refrains. Groups on side B frequently end with similar signs, creating something closer to rhyme or closure. The two faces of the disk behave differently from each other, which is unusual for a straightforward text, but entirely consistent with a device that assigns different functions to different sides. If the disk is a game board, one face could govern offensive moves, while the other governs defensive responses. If it is a ritual object, one face could contain invocations and the other responses. The asymmetry does not tell us what the disk is. but it does tell us that treating both faces as continuous reading material is probably wrong. The mathematical threshold that kills every proposed translation was formalized by Elizabeth Wayland Barber in 1974. She demonstrated that a corpus must reach a minimum size before statistical analysis can distinguish a genuine decipherment from an elaborate coincidence. The Phaistos Disc, with its 241 signs, falls far below that threshold. Every translation ever proposed fits the data, and that is precisely the problem. When everything fits, nothing is confirmed. The problem is not that the disc contains too little information. The problem is that 241 signs distributed across 45 types in 61 compartments create just enough structure to support almost any reading a determined researcher wants to impose. A skilled linguist can find patterns that align with early Greek morphology. An equally skilled linguist can find patterns that align with Anatolian verb forms. A third can map the signs to a Semitic root system with comparable confidence. All three readings are internally consistent, and all three contradict each other. The disc provides just enough data to be tantalizing and nowhere near enough to be conclusive. Epigrapher Sylvia Ferrara summarized the persistent failure pattern during a 2022 documentary interview. She said every generation produces confident translations, and that the corpus is simply too small to distinguish a genuine solution from an elaborate coincidence, calling it the mathematical reality that Barber formalized, and that has not changed. The long parade of failed solutions did accomplish one thing. It gradually pushed researchers away from the symbols and back toward the physical object itself, which is exactly where the 2026 study picked up the thread. The algorithm that needs a second fingerprint. A 2024 systematic review published in the journal Computational Linguistics cataloged every computational method that has ever been applied to Bronze Age Aegean and Cypriot scripts, including the Phaistos Disc, alongside Linear A, Linear B, Cretan hieroglyphic, and Cypro-Minoan. Modern algorithms can enumerate repeated symbol sequences, measure positional behavior, calculate frequency distributions, and test structural similarities against better understood scripts at speeds and scales that no human researcher could match. But they cannot generate the one thing that would actually solve the problem. They cannot produce a second text written in the same script. Machine learning models trained on Linear B Egyptian hieroglyphs and Ugaritic cuneiform have achieved impressive results on those systems because they had large enough corpora to learn from. The Phaistos Disc offers no such luxury. A neural network fed 241 tokens arranged in 61 groups cannot learn a language. It can only describe the distribution of what it was given. Computational linguist Thea Sommerschild captured the fundamental limitation at a 2025 panel at the Institute for Advanced Study. She said that we can now measure the disc's internal regularities with a precision no earlier generation possessed, but that we cannot confirm a match when only one fingerprint exists, and that the next piece of clay will decide more than any algorithm. That is the brutal truth about the Phaistos Disc. It is not waiting for a smarter researcher or a faster computer. It is waiting for a shovel to hit the right patch of earth on Crete and pull up a second object stamped with the same 45 signs. Every computational tool we have built, every neural network trained on ancient scripts, every statistical framework designed to crack unknown writing systems, all of them hit the same wall. They can describe the disc's internal structure with extraordinary precision. They can tell you which signs cluster together, which positions are statistically locked, and which frequency patterns deviate from randomness. But none of that precision can substitute for a second example. A fingerprint only becomes evidence when you have something to match it against. Active excavation at Phaistos and surrounding Minoan sites continues, and every season brings the possibility that a matching object could emerge from the soil. The palace complex itself has not been fully excavated. Entire wings remain buried or only partially explored, and the broader Messara Plain contains dozens of smaller Minoan settlements that have received limited archaeological attention. If a second stamped disc exists, it could be sitting under a meter of earth within walking distance of where the first one was found, waiting for a trench to cut through the right layer. Until that second fingerprint surfaces, the disc will keep sitting in its glass case in Heraklion, 3,700 years old, surrounded by crowds of visitors who stare at symbols that no one alive can read, on an object whose very purpose remains an open argument between people who believe it is a lost language and people who believe it was never language at all. The Phaistos Disc might be the last great mystery of the Bronze Age that we can still physically hold in our hands, and nobody knows if we will ever solve it. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us what you think this object really was.